In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass in North Africa. While the Germans, Italians, and British were engaged in Egypt and Libya, the Americans acquiesced to British pressure and began planning Operation Torch. This was a plan to initiate landings to occupy Algeria and Morocco and to co-opt the Vichy French in North Africa. The Vichy French government had reached an agreement with the Germans, allowing a French government headed by Marshal Henri Pétain to govern the French colonies in those parts of France not occupied by the Germans. Meanwhile, the Free French had established their own government in exile, led by Charles de Gaulle. France and its colonies were thus divided into three pieces: German-occupied France, Vichy France, and the insurgent Free French. French colonies in North Africa then proved to be the focus of Allied efforts to undermine Vichy France and, by extension, Germany. This map shows the battle plan, order of battle for Operation Torch. Anglo-American forces landed at Casablanca in the west, in Morocco, in Oran, northern Algeria, and Algiers, and then advanced by land and sea to Tunisia. At first, the Vichy French resisted. Eventually, they surrendered. A few units, however, remained loyal to the Germans and headed to Tunisia. Eisenhower, with the support of Roosevelt and Churchill, made agreements with Admiral Francois Darlan that Darlan would be given control of North Africa if he joined the Allied side. Here he is pictured on this slide. This enraged Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces, but Darlan was eventually killed by an assassin later in 1942. Noting the collapse of the French in North Africa, Hitler ordered Rommel to rush troops to Tunis before the Allies could get there. Hitler was successful in winning this so-called race to Tunis, and therefore denying the Allies total control of Mediterranean shipping lanes. As you'll see on further maps, the distance between Tunisia and Sicily is very short. This victory, though, came at a great price, as it forced Italian and German troops to what turned out to be an ultimately hopeless fight when they could have been used better elsewhere. This map shows the region of North Africa where German and Allied forces faced off in early 1943. Leading U.S. forces at this time was General Lloyd Friedendahl. He was a kind of hands-off commander who rarely left the command post. He was typically stationed 60 to 70 miles from the front in underground bunkers. He once was rebuked by Eisenhower, although not directly. Eisenhower had called out his generals and pointing out that they, from time to time, had to be near the front lines, if only for troop morale. Friedendahl's verbal orders were often vague. They lacked the precision that's required for successful military operations. He frequently bypassed his immediate subordinates and would contact directly field officers when he had questions or wanted to give orders. He was particularly at odds with one of his immediate subordinates, Major General Wade. Friedendahl had a habit of ignoring advice from commanders who had been farther forward in combat zones and who had actually reconnoitered the battlefield. Some U.S. officers in II Corps were embarrassed by their headquarters when other officers visited. I have a few quotes of Friedendahl's imprecise manner, giving orders such as, "Go get him at once, go smash him." And one report to higher-ups when he was discussing the state of affairs, "Everything is rosy," he wrote. Troops had gone to town. This is his summation of what had happened in the previous battle. Yet, as fun as it is in some ways to criticize Friedendahl, and he certainly was somewhat inept as a field commander. Eisenhower himself should share some of the blame in the leadership failures. He was bogged down with political problems, not the least of which was how to divide up territory between Darlan and de Gaulle, and he failed to provide strong leadership in the weeks prior to Rommel's offensive at Kasserine Pass. The Germans had correctly identified that the Allies were thinly deployed and struggling with logistics in Tunisia. Rommel believed that the Allied forces were critically weak and poorly positioned, and he correctly deduced that they were quite vulnerable. Simply put, Allied intelligence failed, despite the fact that they had received decryption from Ultra. The First Army incorrectly identified that the Germans would attack in the north. General Anderson diverted units to back up the weak French 19th Corps. This resulted in weakness further south. The First Army was convinced that attack was coming, so they had that much right. Two corps, however, had amassed a large amount of hard evidence that the attack would come in their sector. However, due to a strong First Army intelligence estimate and the radio intercepts, the two corps intelligence was ignored, and the French forces were strengthened, leaving the south weak. After El Alamein, Montgomery had been unable to cut off Rommel. Rommel had been able to evacuate across Egypt into Libya and finally reach Tunisia. He developed a plan to race up from southern Tunisia and attack Allied supply dumps in eastern Algeria. Rommel attacked on February 14, 1943, and quickly punched his way through the Kasserine Pass. Ostensibly, his plan was to create a buffer for the German western flank. He also dreamed that the Allies might retreat into Algeria, or that he might be able to make a right turn, drive north, and cut off the Allies, who would then be stuck in Tunisia. But beyond that, however, his decision to advance through the Kasserine Pass offered little in the way of realistic objectives. Theoretically, Rommel could have raced all the way to Morocco if he wanted to, but he faced logistical barriers in the same, not the least of which was the already diminished supply of fuel for German armor. He faced a lack of cooperation with the other field commander to the south, and the supply lines were desperately stretched thin. This was a tactical victory at Kasserine Pass, but Rommel was unable to continue with his larger aims, and the Germans started withdrawing 8 days later on February 22nd. After coming back to the pass, Rommel turned south against the British, who were arriving from Egypt. Montgomery dealt Rommel a stunning defeat, particularly with artillery barrages, destroying hundreds of German tanks. Rommel departed Africa after Hitler relieved him of his command. The Axis position in North Africa, as we know from earlier lectures, steadily deteriorated. In early May, the Allies controlled Tunisia. Allied losses at Kasserine Pass were over 10,000 soldiers, including 5,600 wounded or killed Americans. The Allies lost almost 200 tanks in this engagement. However, in terms of ratios, these losses are even more astounding. The Allies lost almost 6 times as many tanks as the Germans in this battle, and almost 5 times as many troops were wounded or killed. Due to the failures at Kasserine Pass and in other sectors in Tunisia, the Americans had to make some changes. They had not performed well in this first major combat experience in North Africa. This was in part due to the fact that American troops were fairly new, while German troops that they faced were battle-hardened veterans with years of experience fighting in the North African desert. However, American senior leadership in particular failed to anticipate a wide variety of problems, failed to heed intelligence assessments, and American casualties, as we mentioned early on in the campaign, were astoundingly high. General Omar Bradley is on record as telling General Eisenhower about Friedendahl. It's pretty bad. I've talked to all the division commanders. To a man, they've lost confidence in Friedendahl as the corps commander. Eisenhower quickly relieved Friedendahl of command, replaced him with George Patton. Initially, Patton was fairly diplomatic in his dealings with Friedendahl, especially as Patton goes. But a week later, after evaluating his troops and the organization, Patton had a new opinion of Friedendahl, and I'm quoting here. I cannot see what Friedendahl did to ever justify his existence in North Africa. And with that, we will draw to a close our brief look at the Battle of Kasserine Pass.